Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman. I thank you for joining me today to discuss what to me is really the most essential right of all Americans, the right to vote. I'm here and proud to be here with some of the state's leading fighters for voting rights and for reform, Yvette Alfonso of Citizen Action, Jennifer Clark from the Brennan Center, Blair Warner from NYPIRG, Trevon Mayers from Common Cause, and Ethan Geringer-Semet from Citizens Union. Ladies and gentlemen, the right to vote is the right that enables you to protect all of your other rights. And yet, here in New York, we seem to have systematically made it much, much harder to register and vote than it needs to be, and this year's elections shone a harsh light on the realities of New York's registration and voting systems. The April 2016 presidential primary made it very clear how bad our current systems are. I have strong views on how we can fix them, which I will share with you. But as I'm sure you'll remember, the April primary was hotly contested on both the Republican and Democratic sides. Millions of New Yorkers were eager to have their voices heard, but far too many of them found those voices silenced by our state's embarrassingly outdated voting systems. As soon as the polls opened on primary day, New Yorkers started flooding my office's election complaint hotline with complaints of long lines, broken scanning machines, missing names on voter rolls, and a variety of other complaints. By the time the primary was over, we had received 1,500 calls, 10 times more than we had ever received before on an election day. And the calls came from all over the state, from Buffalo to Albany to Brooklyn to Long Island. Based on the volume of these complaints, I directed my Civil Rights Bureau to begin an exhaustive examination into what happened. And we uncovered significant voting problems before, during, and after the actual votes were cast. So today we're announcing the results of that inquiry, issuing a report on the problems with our voting system, and proposing a package of reforms that could fix many of the issues we've identified. Our statewide inquiry uncovered major problems with the way New York State registers voters before elections and the way we conduct actual voting on election day. The problems with registration are the first category that we examine. Simply put, New York's registration system is cumbersome, confusing, and leaves large numbers of voters unable to participate. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, New York has the 5th worst registration numbers in the country. And when it comes to actual voter participation, the number of those eligible to vote who actually cast their ballots, we are the 3rd worst in the country. This is totally unacceptable, and it is something that we can and must change. The party enrollment rules in New York, in particular, offer an insight into how unwieldy many of our voting laws are. Nearly 30% of New Yorkers have chosen not to be affiliated permanently with one party or another. Many of those, approximately 3 million unaffiliated voters, were energized and wanted to participate in the April presidential primary, but they could not, because New York has the most ridiculous change of registration rules in the entire United States of America. Since we have closed primaries, so a registered voter who wants to participate in a party primary has to switch their registration to that party. And under New York law, they have to switch their party, quote, at least 25 days prior to the general election in the year prior to the primary. So for the April 19th, 2016 primary, New Yorkers had to enroll as a Democrat or Republican by October 9th of 2015, 193 days before the primary. That's by far the earliest deadline in the country, and it's months before the deadline for presidential candidates to even file to be on the ballot. So it puts New Yorkers in an untenable situation. Hundreds of voters contacted my office to say that they had filed to change party affiliation well before the election, but after the 193-day deadline. They couldn't participate because of that arcane structure. So that rule is emblematic of the voting regime in New York that hurts voters and hurts our democracy. Our inquiry found, in addition, poll books that were riddled with errors, bureaucracies that weren't communicating with each other, and local boards of elections that seemed to simply lose people's registrations and not train their workers in the proper procedures for voting. One determined New York City woman found out that the Department of Motor Vehicles, DMV, had never transmitted her registration to the city's Board of Elections. She fought to obtain a court order to vote. Ladies and gentlemen, our courts are overburdened enough. We don't need to have New Yorkers forced to go to court simply to exercise their fundamental right to vote. And as set forth in detail in our report, the problems went beyond issues concerning registration. When it comes to the actual process of voting, many New Yorkers showed up at polling places they had been going to for years to find that there was no polling place there anymore at all. Others were prevented by undertrained and misinformed poll workers from voting with an affidavit ballot, even though that right is explicitly written into New York law. If your name is not in the book, you are to be given an affidavit ballot. Different boards of elections around the state did not apply the same rules to affidavit ballot voting. As you are well aware, I think, hours-long lines snaked around many polling places thanks to reduced polling hours in some places, broken ballot scanners, and the fact that, unlike 37 other states and the District of Columbia, New York makes no provision for early voting. The problems were profound and the problems were widespread. So, ladies and gentlemen, my philosophy on issues related to the franchise is very simple. Laws that make it easier for New Yorkers to register and vote are good laws. Laws that make it harder for New Yorkers to register and vote are bad laws. And in far too many cases, New York's laws fall in the latter category. Across the nation, we have been seeing an attack on voting rights, legal voter suppression in states around the country. It is critical that New York takes the lead and shows a different path forward by expanding voting rights. And that's why I'm here today, not just to point out problems, which we provide a lot of detail about in our report, but we also offer solutions. The solutions that are in the back of the report I issued today are going to form the heart of the New York Vote Acts, a reform package that I will be introducing at the start of this year's legislative session that will go a long way towards resolving the issues identified in the report and making New York a national leader on voting rights. The reform package is aimed at boosting registration and turnout across the state, making our democracy healthier, and making our government more reflective of the people of the state of New York. You can read the whole plan on my website, but I want to highlight a few of the most important parts. First, my reforms would finally bring early voting to New York. This election cycle, we watched as millions of voters outside of New York voted at their convenience in the weeks before Election Day. Early voting makes it easier for working people to vote, and it cuts down on the long lines and the pressure on the polls on Election Day. I also am calling for automatic voter registration, which is in effect in other states and makes any contact with a state agency a presumptive application to register to vote. The agency then follows up to add whatever information is missing. And this would dramatically increase New York's voter registration rate, again, currently the 5th worst in the nation. It would also, we would also like to make it much easier to vote by mail by removing the requirement that voters have an excuse to get an absentee ballot. If voting by absentee makes it easier for you to participate, you should be able to do it, no questions asked. Unfortunately, in New York, we've placed severe restrictions on the ability to get an absentee ballot. No reason we can't change that. Many other states have done it before us. My reform package also calls for standardized training for poll workers across the state. Albany County's election board is actually ahead of the game on this one, having created formal training programs for staff on the different parts of processing registration, enabling people to vote. Other counties should follow Albany's lead, but as set forth in the report, it really is up to the State Board of Elections to ensure that there are uniform rules for voting. We found wide disparities in, for example, the way different local boards handled affidavit ballots. Some followed the law and gave out ballots freely. Some refused to give out affidavit ballots at all. And in one remarkable statement, someone at one of the boards of elections stated that we will give you an affidavit ballot, but only if you fight hard for it. I'm not sure what standard that is, but it's certainly something that is incomprehensible and unlawful. Finally, we need to fix our primary system. We need to shorten the deadline dramatically for changing your party's affiliation to allow more people to participate in primaries, and we must consolidate the number of primary elections we currently have. This year, we held 4 separate elections: the presidential primary, a congressional primary in June, September state legislative primary, and the general election in November. This is a recipe for confusion and low voter turnout. Consolidating elections would also save the state tens of millions of dollars, which could be used to train poll workers, expand poll hours, and other reforms. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no right more important than the right to vote. And New York has had a long history of leadership in the civil rights movement. It has had a long leadership in progressive causes generally. We are an outlier. We are at the back of the pack when it comes to voting rights. It is time for New York to lead on voting rights as well. I want to say in closing, my office has an ongoing investigation into the purging of about 100,000 Brooklyn residents from the voter rolls before the April primary. We will share the results of that investigation with you when it is complete. That is not a part of the report that we're presenting today. But as the report makes clear, and as our proposals make clear, it's not going to be that difficult for New York to show the nation what a truly vibrant democracy looks like. The reforms that we are outlining in our report, proposing today, and that my colleagues in efforts to reform our state government are going to speak about, will go a very long way towards putting New York where it should be, at the lead of voting rights efforts across America. Thank you. And now I want to introduce a few of my colleagues who are going to speak. First of all, Yvette Alfonso, the president of Citizen Action of New York.
Good morning. This is what happens when you're on the short side. Can I take this one?
Yeah.
Can it come off? Or?
They can hear you. It's pretty strong.
Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Citizen Action is a grassroots organization statewide that works on many different issues, and one of them, of course, is the right of people to vote. It should be one person, one vote, but we're far from that here in New York State. We thank the Attorney General for his inquiry, for the report, and really urge that the governor and the legislatures follow through on the reforms, some of which the Attorney General just mentioned. In terms of those restrictive deadlines, we know that even a certain president-elect's children were not able to vote for him because of those kinds of crazy deadlines. The communication between the Board of Elections and the local polling places is also very faulty. My own daughter was unable to, when she got there, they couldn't find her name, even though she's been voting forever, and eventually had to be given a provisional or affidavit ballot to be able to vote. Not very encouraging, to say the least. While other states have been restricting early voting hours, and we read a lot about that during this campaign season, we don't even have voting hours to restrict. So that is something that definitely has to change. The auto registration, I think, is also a very, very worthwhile thing. One other thing I wanted to mention was, and this is a reform that's mentioned here, about giving full voting rights to people who are on parole. When people, and then beyond parole, when people have finished their sentences, they should be able to have their voting rights fully restored. A couple of years ago, when we were doing an electoral campaign, a gentleman was very, very excited because he had been in prison for a number of years and was finally going to be able to vote. He was so ecstatic that he could do that. I still tear up when I think about that. But, you know, we keep putting barriers to people like him to be able to vote. And when you think about the mass incarceration in this country and who gets sent to prison, we know that it particularly impacts people of color. So these reforms are really important for all our citizens. throughout the state. And we really want to have a thriving democracy and get out of that basement number where we are, 46 in the country in voting turnout. These reforms have to, the vote report has to be heeded, these reforms have to be implemented. And again, I really, really urge the legislators to get out there, take these reforms seriously, and let's get them enacted in this session. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we're going to hear from Jennifer Clark from the Brennan Center of Justice.
Thank you. The Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law is proud to be here today for the announcement of the 2017 New York Votes Act. We are so glad the Attorney General is leading the charge to make crucial changes to our election system, which New York State so desperately needs. The Act promises to cover many pressing issue areas. Among those planned reforms with the biggest potential for impact is automatic voter registration. The concept behind automatic voter registration is simple. Instead of our current system, where voters have to fill out a separate form in advance of the election to get themselves registered, under automatic registration, eligible voters who interact with government agencies are automatically registered to vote unless they decline. In addition to moving us from an opt-in to an opt-out system, automatic registration also moves us to a paperless system. We start sending things electronically from agencies that register voters to election officials. This switch helps reduce errors on the rolls, and it also saves the government money because the less paper that gets pushed around and mailed, the more money the government saves. Voters actually already think that their registration moves with them when they move from place to place and are often surprised when they realize that they have to re-register. Automatic voter registration would go a long way toward making voter registration portable, moving with voters from place to place. It also has the power to transform our electorate. In New York State, automatic voter registration could add up to 1 million unregistered voters to the rolls. If passed into law, the 2017 New York Votes Act would be a nationwide leader because it would bring automatic registration to social service agencies beyond just the DMV, which would help make sure that our electorate truly represents the diversity of New York. And in order for the electorate to represent the diversity of our state, the right to vote cannot be denied to eligible citizens who are working and raising families in our communities, simply because of a past criminal conviction. Currently, our state disenfranchises New Yorkers with a felony conviction who are on parole, a policy with a disproportionate impact on minority citizens. Under the Act, these individuals would get their right to vote back, meaning that 40,000 New Yorkers would get a second chance to contribute to our state. The bill also proposes an expanded online voter registration system, same-day registration, early voting, increased language access, and permanent registration for voters who relocate within the state. All of these reforms are proven ways to improve the voting experience, and we applaud their inclusion in the bill. The Brennan Center looks forward to working with the Attorney General on this proposal, and we also call on all legislators to support the Act, which will go a long way toward making elections free, fair, and accessible in New York State. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And now a longtime ally in the struggle for reform, representing an organization that I actually represented as a pro bono attorney many years ago, my friend Blair Warner from Nyberg.
Thank you. Good morning. These package of reforms, we believe, are coming at the right time. America is involved in a national debate over voting. However, the discussion is driven by those who are falsely arguing that many illegal votes were cast. Yet there's too little discussion over the real problems, such as millions of legal votes not being cast due to registration laws, long lines, confusion, and that equals voter suppression, often deliberate. And New York State has suffered from institutional voter suppression. That's the result of weak laws, poor training, meager resources devoted to voting, and partisan gridlock at the Board of Elections. The AG deserves credit for handling the complaints and for offering Albany a blueprint for action. The governor and the legislature should make New York State a national leader in voting and democracy, an engine that pulls the nation, a leader, not the caboose. We appreciate the Attorney General's efforts in this area, and we look forward to working with him and the rest of the partners in Albany to make these bills become a reality. Thank you.
Thank you. And now another long-term ally, Trevon Mayers from Common Cause is going to speak.
Good morning. I want to first thank the Attorney General for the opportunity to be here today and discuss a meaningful election reform agenda here in New York. Common Cause supports protecting the integrity of our elections and our democracy, but unfortunately this past election cycle has reminded us that there are many unacceptable barriers that continue to suppress voter participation, especially in low-income and historically marginalized communities. As a result, many people are prevented from exercising their right to vote. New York can and should be an example for the rest of the country on how to protect voting rights, that everyone has a fair chance to exercise their voting rights and be a fully engaged citizen. But instead, New York is well behind many states on election reform. Historically, New York has one of the lowest voter turnout rates in the country. New York is also one of 13 states that do not allow early voting and no excuse absentee voting. There are other states that are also using New York as an example to either not support election reform or to roll back reform measures in their own state. So they argue, if New York isn't doing it, then why should we? It's past time New York be a leader again in adopting simple reform measures, and those reform measures can put us back on that path. First, we need to modernize New York voter registration. Right now, registration deadline for voting in a general election is 25 days before the election. To vote in the last primary, like the Attorney General mentioned, the deadline to enroll in your party was 6 months before the primary. So voters who become engaged towards the end of an election cycle are often denied the right to register to vote. So shortening the deadline is a simple solution. Automatic voter registration is also another solution. 6 states have already adopted it, and it has shown an increase in voter participation. Second, we need to bring early voting to New York State. Voters who are in school, working, or taking care of their families deserve a chance to vote when it's convenient for them, and the best way to do that is through early voting. And lastly, we support the use of electronic poll books. Paper-based poll books are outdated, they're costly, and they create long lines that make it more difficult for people to vote. A simple change to New York's election law could speed up that process for voters. Our democracy should ensure that every voice is heard, and New York has an opportunity to adopt simple reforms that can do that. Thank you.
And finally, from our friends at Citizens Union, Ethan Geringer-Smith.
Good morning. My name is Ethan Geringer-Smith. I'm representing Citizens Union and our Executive Director, Dick Dady, who unfortunately couldn't be here this morning. Citizens Union is pleased to have Attorney General Schneiderman's leadership on this important issue to modernize and improve the way New Yorkers register to vote and cast ballots. New York may not actively seek to suppress voter participation like other states did during the past election, but its antiquated system of voting is nothing other than a passive form of voter suppression. Citizens Union has launched a 10-year campaign to increase voter turnout throughout the state of New York to achieve many of the reforms laid out in Attorney General Schneiderman's proposal. And we look forward to working with him on these issues. New York has one of the lowest voter turnout rates in the country, in large part due to our old-fashioned voting laws and processes that produce non-competitive elections. Our election system must focus on modernization by increasing the ways and number of days New Yorkers have to cast ballots, which this package of reform seeks to do. Thank you.
Thank you.